Bum 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 ba bum bum. Hello, ba bum bum. Hello. How's everybody doing today? Welcome to another episode of Murder in the Morning with your host Eli. I'm finally feeling better. Not gonna hit you with a cough right off the bat or make you sit through sniffles left and right. I'm talking to you, Ryan. Uh, but he did have a point. I sounded like a dirty muffler. This week, I had a really hard time choosing which case to cover. So initially, I didn't have anything other than I wanted a somewhat happy ending for a story this week. So originally, I started searching on Google just survivor tales or true crime survivor stories. And there's plenty of them out there. I mean, we all know the classic ones like Mary Vincent, who survived one of the most gruesome attacks I've ever heard of. And I found one really close to where I live here in New Hampshire. And for a moment, I thought for sure this is the one I'm certainly going to cover today. It's like 30 miles away from where I live currently. It's a survival story about a young girl who was kidnapped after school, held captive for 9 months, and somehow managed to come out on the other side. Just an amazing story. I was dead set on that one, and I still think I want to do it at some point. But with just one Google click down, there was another article that really piqued my interest. And this one kind of unlocked a memory that I had not thought of in years. I don't know if many of you know about this one or not. I mean, it got quite the headlines back in 1999, 2000, but that was 20 years ago. It's the story of Katie Poirier, the kidnapping and murder of a young girl. Now, this didn't just pop up randomly on my Google search for survivors because, well, she's not a survivor, unfortunately. But there was an article just this past month about the man who committed the crime and how he died. Um, so obviously, we don't want to celebrate murder or death too often, but you'll come to see how utterly inhuman this man is, and I think we can be happy that he has graciously left this earth. And what makes this even cooler is that while I wanted to do my new hometown, New Hampshire survivor story, but this Katie Poyer story actually takes place one town over from where I grew up in Minnesota. So, which that's kind of why I told you it unlocked a memory when that article had popped up and I read it. I was quite surprised. I mean, I was only 2 when she was originally kidnapped, but I still have memories of doing like the Katie Poyer 5K walk as a toddler, and their family raising money for this fundraiser they had back then. But clearly, I was very young when it happened, and I don't remember too much other than these little flashes. So I figured, why not take a deep dive into this tragedy and learn a little bit more about what happened just mere miles away from where I was just sucking down baby food. All right, let's set the scene for you. It's May of 1999 in Moose Lake, Minnesota. We finally made it through another presumably horrible winter, followed by more unfortunate weather in March and April. But now we've arrived in the warm months. We can finally go outside again in shorts and not worry if there's going to be a blizzard next week while it's 65 and sunny today. It's kind of funny when people ask me if I like living in Minnesota or if I did like living there. And I honestly never really know what to say. It's a love hate relationship, that's for sure. Anyways, on May 26th, Katie Poyer, who was 19 at the time, she was working her usual late night shift at a Conoco gas station, or they called it a service station. Being from that area, there isn't too much for work. I think in my town alone, there were 2 restaurants and 1 gas station, among a few other small businesses. So there's not very many options. And working at a gas station was quite common. Nowadays, when I go back home, I see a lot of kids working at the Quick Trip in that area, which is my personal favorite store. Plus, it always seems as a teen or a young adult entering the workforce, you're kind of stuck working the crappy shifts no matter where. So it's no surprise to me that that night, May 26th, they had her on an overnight at the time, which wouldn't be so bad by itself. But when you couple it with the fact that she was alone on this night shift, makes it a little bit more of a strenuous situation. And it sucks. It really sucks that it's unsafe to just be alone after dark or even before dark as a woman back then or even now today. It shouldn't have been a dangerous situation, but it became one. A little while after midnight, somebody had come in to use the store or get gas or was simply walking by. They had noticed that there was no attendant behind the register to help anyone. So I assume this stranger had peeked around or rang a bell on the desk that may have been present. But after a while, this passerby decided to call the police. Seeing that nobody was there, they found it quite odd overall. And when police arrived, it's not clear if they called the store's manager or the owner, but essentially they got access to a very low quality tape recording of what had happened that night. And when examining this footage, the police saw that around 11:40 p.m., Katie Poirier left the store with a man wearing a backwards baseball cap, a Yankees jersey with the number 23, and blue jeans. Upon further examination of the tape, police noticed the man holding the back of Katie's neck in such a way that it almost looked like there was something tied around her neck, like he was already choking her while still in the store. Quickly, this man hurried her outside and disappeared. Witnesses later came forward to give information about a suspect looking truck parked near the convenience store. These witnesses identified it as black, and they were able to give a partial license plate number, 3 numbers, and 1 letter. And unfortunately, this old, grainy, black and white footage was the last time anyone saw Katie Poirier alive. You can actually Google this yourself and watch the clip. It's only like 20 seconds long, and it really is low quality. I myself couldn't make out that he was wearing a Yankee jersey, let alone the number 23. The only thing I could really tell was that he had her by the neck, and she looked extremely nervous as he led her out of the front door. So at this point, normally I would want to take a little time to talk about who Katie was as a person, and what she was doing up until this point in her life. But unfortunately, all of the articles I found heavily focused on um, the man who committed the crime, and I wasn't particularly able to find anything in depth about Katie's personal life, unfortunately. But what I did find were some amazing photos on Google Images that showcase what seems like a young Joyce woman excited to start her new young adult life. There's a few photos of her dressed up as the first runner-up to, I think, prom queen, and then another photo of her with the widest grin on her face, smiling next to her 2 massive dogs. So even without anyone telling me or putting it in writing, you can tell that she was a seemingly happy girl and did not deserve what had come to her in 1999. All right. So the police at this point, in the days that follow, they have this short 20-second surveillance footage clip of the incident, a partial license plate from a witness, and the description of a pickup truck. Shortly, with the witnesses that had come forward, they were able to compile a composite sketch as well and release this to the public. Now, to me, this doesn't seem like too much to go on, but luckily and very, very quickly, the police were able to run the partial plate through the system and found an interesting hit almost immediately. So one man raised their suspicions, and his name was Donald Blom, spelled Blom. So he had a pickup that matched the partial plate. However, it was white, whereas the witnesses had described a dark-colored pickup truck the night of the kidnapping. So I'd like to make a note that while the police are investigating, the community also came together in a big way. Apparently, hundreds of people came from all over to join law enforcement searchers, the National Guard, and just everyday volunteers. They formed a 5 to 10 mile radius around the gas station, and they searched for days, setting up a shop at, I believe, a Lutheran church. But unfortunately, throughout all their good efforts, Katie had not turned up. And at the same time this was happening, back with the police force, another man by the name of Daryl Brown, he saw the released composite sketch and thought to himself, this looks an awful lot like my coworker Donald Hutchinson, who at the time was working for a Minnesota veterans home. And it just so happened that this, quote, Donald Hutchinson was out of work the day after Katie's disappearance. He had recently changed his appearance, cut his hair, and stopped driving a black pickup truck, all within the day after Katie had disappeared. And then to top it off, he goes and quits his job out of nowhere. So, you and I are both thinking, as well as the police, this seems awfully suspicious. Some guy with the same first name, two pickups, one of them matching the one at the scene, plus a variety of odd behaviors. This Donald character immediately became a prime suspect. So once police started to dig, they were able to find out that his real name was Donald Blom, like I had mentioned. And he just happened to be going by the false name of Donald Hutchinson at the time. But who was this Mr. Blom, besides being a very, very despicable human being? Donald Albin Blom, born in 1949, was an American man and a dun 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 dun, dun registered sex offender. So there's not a whole lot of history on this guy's childhood or his early years, other than simply his criminal activity. Um, I got I went to 4 or 5 different websites, and every single one of those had the same 3 paragraphs titled "quote early life," and they were essentially word for word the same on every single website. So that's where I got this information, and I'll do my best not to plagiarize. But according to these article, his father was also not a very nice guy. It was said that he started to abuse him when Donald was 13 years old, but I can see how that was only the reported abuse rather than the unreported abuse that could have started much earlier. This essentially forced Donald to turn to alcohol, and he became quite the fan, let's say. It affected him greatly. He would miss class, skip school entirely, was an overall nuisance of a teenager, and soon, in 10th grade, he was sent to a reform school, which, as we know, proved fruitless. Before moving on here into a little bit more of Donald's eccentric history, I just like to issue a little warning for sexual assault. If anyone's sensitive to that, just skip forward a little bit here. But this is where we see the first big gap in Donald's history. So 10th grade year, sent to reform school, probably 16. The next reported incident of Donald was when he was 26, 10 years later in 1975. This monster kidnapped, gagged, and raped a 14-year-old girl and then proceeded to lock her in the trunk of his car. 14 years old when he was 26. So not only is he a rapist, kidnapper, but he's also a pedophile. But somehow, thankfully, this young, unnamed girl was able to escape his clutches and turn him in. End of story, right? 26-year-old pedophile rapist gets arrested. He's in jail for the remainder of his life. Wrong. Like, really, really wrong. Only 3 years later, he was out on the streets again to commit aggravated assault in 1978. Like, I realize this is the 70s, but less than 3 friggin' years in jail for kidnapping and a rape of a minor. That's insane. And this trend, unfortunately, would continue. 5 years later, when we next hear of Donald, he was arrested yet again in 1983 for more sexual or criminal sexual conduct. I feel like this was a rough year for this guy because in 1983 he really decided to ramp things up even more, and he decided to kidnap 2 more teenage girls. And what he did to them was unspeakable. This is a quote directly from Murderpedia because I wouldn't want to describe it any better myself. So, quote, the same year, he also threatened 2 teenage girls at knife point in a remote area. He tied them to a tree, put socks in their mouth, he choked them, and revived one of them several times and said he was going to rape them. The girls were rescued when a police officer saw their car parked the wrong way and came by. Blom fled into the woods and later changed his appearance by dyeing his hair. He was arrested 2 months later when one of the girls recognized him and pleaded guilty to the crime. End quote. Like, who does this guy think he is? Clearly, he's never learned his lesson, and he's not going to. Nobody cares whether he's in jail or not. How many times can Donald get caught, apprehended, and released just to do the same thing over and over again? Frustrating. Very frustrating. So, at some point in 1992, uh, there was a psychologist who said that Mr. Donald Bloom would need to be monitored very closely. Otherwise, he will continue to do what they described as antisocial activities. Like, what the fuck does that even mean? I, I'm antisocial when I get a little bit too high and I can't read the room. This guy's assaulting teenage girls. Like, I'd hardly describe that as antisocial behavior. But alas, he was released once more, somewhere between 1992 and 1999, and was able to move, get a new name, a new job, and never be monitored by any type of law enforcement or probation officer. And within this time, he also somehow managed to get married. Again, this guy is a convicted kidnapper, convicted rapist. Who knows if he's killed somebody up to this point? And he's getting married? What am I doing wrong? So, anyways, up until this point in May of 1999, before Katie's kidnapping and disappearance, he had stacked up 6 felony convictions, 5 of which involved either sexual assault or kidnapping. Now, armed with new knowledge of Donald's history, Daryl's tip about the suspicious behavior and the matching composite sketch, as well as the partial plate, the police feel they have enough to arrest this man. So on June 22nd, officers arrested Donald down near Richfield, Minnesota, which, for those of you who aren't near the area, is near the Twin Cities, where he had been camping. I assume he was down there camping to avoid being in the Moose Lake area where Katie had gone missing. And immediately after his arrest, investigators were able to obtain search warrants for his properties. It turns out that Donald had a 20-acre plot of land only 12 miles from the service station where Katie had been kidnapped. The police, National Guard, and many others extensively searched his house and the 20-acre property he owned. Unfortunately, on the first day of searches, investigators were unable to find anything other than a handful of firearms that he was not allowed to own. But they knew they had so much more ground to cover that they hadn't given up quite yet. We got there. On the second day, though, inside one of Mr. Bloom's fire pits, investigators found charred bone fragments, which they were able to send to a lab. And it turned out that these bone fragments were human bones and a few teeth fragments or tooth fragments. The tests themselves on the bones were inconclusive, but highly suggestive that they matched Katie's profile. It's not like today where the DNA can be a 100% match, done and done, case solved. This was more, it looks like it could be a match, but we can't say for sure. However, it didn't seem to matter in the long run because on September 8th, Donald Bloom himself confessed. He confessed to abducting, strangling, and burning Katie Poirier in his fire pit. His confession went as such, quote, he said that on May 26, 1999, he had gone fishing and then driven home to Richfield. However, later that evening, he had returned to his Moose Lake property. On the way, he had stopped to purchase liquor and to have a beer at the bar. He had seen Katie in the store doing some chores. He had not known her, but he made a graph for her, and he said she had run outside. He followed her and forced her into his pickup truck. Then he had driven her out to his mobile home. He continues to say, I don't know if it was just out of guilt or something or whatever, feeling stupid, but then I choked her and killed her. He had choked her from behind, saying it had taken about 20 minutes. He did not admit to any other type of assault, and once he knew she was dead, he placed her body in the fire pit in a fetal position and gathered wood to make it burn. So, Donald, you really don't have any reason at all other than feeling stupid or whatever. Well, I can assure you that you aren't just feeling stupid. You are extremely and utterly stupid. So congratulations. But yeah, that was his reasoning. He just made a grab for her, and she had run outside. But we all know she didn't run outside. That was a little inconsistent. He had forced her outside, but the rest of it seems to match the investigators' uh, story so far. Anyways, I was just rambling. So keep in mind that while the confession is great news for the case itself, it comes as really quite heartbreaking news to Katie's family, who had still been holding out hope to see their baby girl once alive once more. You lose everything at that point. Um, so the confession is good until the trial started, when apparently he had a change of heart and recanted the entire thing, claiming stress induced by solitary confinement and the medications he was on caused him to confess to a crime that he didn't commit. Bullshit. But good news, though, for some reason, the judge had allowed his confession to be used in the trial, even though he had recanted. So now this allowed the jurors to decide whether or not he was telling the truth or lying through his teeth. The trial itself wasn't anything too crazy. Much of the evidence presented, I've already talked about. But the one thing that stuck out to me was, yes, while Donald recanted his confession, during the trial, he was so aggressive towards Katie's family about not being the murderer. He even went as far as to get into a heated debate with Katie's mother, Pam. And at one point, Donald said, "You've got the wrong fucking guy, lady. You look all you want. I'm not your fucking man." End quote. To which Pam Poirier replied, "Get a good look at me. I want my face in your dreams. Always." Which I think is a very reserved thing to say given the circumstances, and I applaud her for that. So the prosecutors end up bringing multiple witnesses forward, including those from the gas station, forensic scientists who studied the tooth, and they were even able to bring in the two girls, well, women now, that he had kidnapped all those years ago, and take their account of what happened back then into account of the trial today. And I thought that was interesting since I hadn't seen that tactic used before. So finally, when Donald himself was cross examined, the only thing he had even expanded on was the baseball jersey, claiming that he never owned a Yankees jersey, never worn one, and anyone who said otherwise was misremembering or lying. This was thoroughly debunked by his brother, his own brother, who said he gave him a Yankees jersey with the number 23 on the back, and multiple people had seen him wearing it. So that was Donald's best efforts. Clearly not the smartest man. The trial concludes after 25 days of testimony, and after a lengthy 10-hour deliberation, Blom is convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Excuse me. So even without Katie's body ever being discovered, he gets this sentence, and it's amazing. Plus, as a little cherry on top, he got an extra 19 years for those illegal firearms I had previously mentioned that they had found in his residence. So after this conviction, Donald's wife, if you remember, he got married somehow. She sent a few letters to state legislators stating that after everything that happened, she truly believes that her husband was the killer of Katie. So Amy, her name, she had also suffered at the hands of Donald from being verbally and physically abused over the course of years of their marriage. She said at some point she feels guilty that she couldn't have done more for Katie, but ultimately knows that she was also a victim of abuse. Um, there really wasn't much she could have done. Donald was the real asshole here, and we can't blame Amy for not taking a stand. The saddest part is that when Donald and Amy did get married years prior, Donald had taken her last name of Blom, and she was simply flattered. You know, she's like, "Oh, that's so nice of you. blah, 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 blah. When in reality, he was only taking her name to change his and conceal his horrible, horrible past. Um, so, yeah, not very flattering after all. In the years following, Donald had tried for multiple appeals and hearings, but he was never given a lighter sentence, thankfully. Um, and now we're going to do a little dance together because the whole reason I started this episode, our dear dickhead Donald has passed away. Whoop, whoop. Now, obviously, like I said, death shouldn't be celebrated too often, but I think we can give a little hoorah for Donald leaving us. Before I go, though, there is one more positive aspect that comes from this terrible case, and that would be Katie's Law. Um, this is a direct quote from Inform that describes the kind of the broad encapsulation of what Katie's Law is doing even today. So, quote, Poirier's murder led to the passage of Katie's Law, which included the development of a statewide crime computer network, tightening tracking requirements for predatory sex offenders such as Blom. The law made it more difficult for felons to change their names, which Blom did, and it lengthened prison sentences for first-degree criminal sexual conduct. It also provided more money for more probation officers and technology and staffing at the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. End quote. So there's a few good things in this law, namely the longer prison sentences, but maybe most importantly, the centralization of information. It just makes it so much easier to track criminals and sex offenders. It makes it easier to monitor them and hopefully prevent some criminals from repeating in the future. So, with that being said, that's all I have for you today. I hope you learned something because I definitely did. And I think that was a good episode today. I don't know about you, a little bit longer. It just felt nice to sit down and talk for a minute. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Y'all have a good day. Bye bye.